conseguenze che lascia presagire.
Hello from the Meloni team.
Now let's get back to Italy. Today is the final day of this year's G7 summit, as we've been telling you, but much of the work has already been wrapped up. Most of the leaders who flew in have already left, including the G7 leaders, like US President Joe Biden. He took off on an Air Force One last night, and while he isn't heading to nearby Switzerland, a bunch of the other leaders are for their next conference, as we've already mentioned. The major leaders were scheduled to leave Italy before today's session, so they wrapped up the important business yesterday, including the all-important G7 joint statement. Giorgia Meloni summarized the major points.
With the final declaration, the G7 has taken on some specific commitments. We will continue to support Ukraine, and we have decided to systematize our efforts in various lines of action with a 360-degree approach to help the Ukrainian people look to the future. The G7 has reaffirmed this commitment, agreeing to additional financial support linked to the windfall profits derived from Russian assets frozen in our jurisdictions.
The most important agreement was on funding for Ukraine. The G7 nations will give Ukraine $50 billion, but not from their own funds. Instead, they will be using Russian money, the interest that has been generated on frozen Russian assets. This is effectively getting Moscow to pay its enemies' bills. It's a unique step, and it's likely to draw a reaction from Russia. That was the biggest takeaway from the G7 summit. Then there is the war in Gaza. All the G7 members have rallied behind the US.
We have confirmed our support for the United States mediation proposal for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the release of all hostages, and a significant increase in humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. The G7 also reiterated every effort to prevent an escalation in the region and to work towards a lasting political solution to the crisis with the perspective of a two-state solution for two peoples.
The G7 is backing the recent US ceasefire proposal. They will also increase humanitarian assistance to Gaza. On paper, this looks like a step towards peace. But can they really do anything to stop Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Until there's a concrete way forward, these just seem like empty words. The third big takeaway involves migration, and this was a personal issue for Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. She's been looking for a way to stop illegal migration to Europe, mostly from Africa. Italy is caught in the middle of this because it is often the gateway for migrants who arrive on Italian shores via the Mediterranean Sea on dilapidated boats. Meloni's plan is simple: stop the problem at its root. A lot of the migrants leave their countries in search of economic opportunities. But why not just bring the opportunities to their home nations? That's the crux of Meloni's strategy. It's called the Mete Plan. And she has managed to open the rest of the G7 for it. She wants to coordinate all their existing efforts to invest in developing nations, like the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment and the EU's Global Gateway Initiative. Meloni wants all these plans to work in tandem to better direct the flow of investments, especially to Africa. So these were the big G7 announcements, the greatest hits, if you will. Ukraine funding, ceasefire in Gaza, and investments in Africa. It shows that a decent amount of work got done here, and the summit wasn't just some holiday for the leaders. The G7 actually came together to chalk out a plan. They were a bit weak in a few other areas, like China. Before the summit, there was a lot of talk and action. The EU raised tariffs on Chinese EVs. The US sanctioned some Chinese firms, companies accused of helping Russia evade sanctions. It looked like a multi-pronged Western attack on Beijing, and we spoke about this earlier. That attack was supposed to gain momentum at the G7 summit. Instead, the attack seems to have lost steam. If you look at the G7 leaders' communique, they are recycling the same accusations and warnings. The G7 have asked China to be responsible, to stop helping Russia, to stop bullying its neighbors, and to stop human rights violations in Xinjiang and Tibet. And they say this every time, but they don't do very much about it. They'll give Beijing a disapproving look and then go back to being blind to China's transgressions. Because at the end of the day, the G7 is also dependent on China, so dependent that they can't do anything except repeat the same old lectures. This was a missed opportunity for the Group of Seven. The summit could have been used to crack down harder on China. Instead, what we saw was meekness.